But this morning we're going to take a step back and kind of look at some of the foundational of who we are as the church and as God's people, and the kind of upside down kingdom that Jesus really is inviting us to. And this morning, I want to start actually with a story about that comes from a movie called Mary Poppins. I don't know if you have seen the new Mary Poppins movie that came out a few years ago, but if you're not familiar with Mary Poppins, basically she's like a nanny, but she seems to have magical powers, or at least magical things happen when Mary is around, right? And in the new movie, Mary Poppins is taking care of children whose mother has passed away, and their family needs money quickly or they're going to lose their house. And so the children in the story break a very expensive bowl, which is heartbreaking partially because they think that it's worth a lot of money and they may need the money to help save their house, but also because it belonged to their now dead mother. And so they're really devastated about it. And Mary Poppins tells them, don't fear, everything's going to be okay. Let's go to my cousin's shop. She has a shop where she can fix things. She fixes things. Her name is Topsy. And as the children come into the shop, Mary kind of warns them that Topsy is an unusual person. But her warning cannot kind of prepare them for what they get when they walk in the door. As soon as they open the door, they find themselves standing on the ceiling of the shop. What now is the floor has chandeliers. So these chandeliers, it's kind of like the chandeliers in our sanctuary, right? That's kind of the image. And so, but it's flipped upside down. So the floor has the chandeliers, and then there's tables and chairs up above them on the ceiling. And so it's upside down, right? Flipped upside down. And so the children kind of weave their way through the chandeliers to find Topsy and give her this ceramic bowl that needs fixed. But immediately Topsy says, no, I can't do this today. Come back any other day. But obviously things are messed up. And she explains why that is. Today is the second Wednesday of the month, she says. And on the second Wednesday, my world turns turtle. And of course, this doesn't really help explain anything to the children. And then they look at her confused. What do you mean, turtle? What does that mean? And so she sings a song, as happens in Mary Poppins movies, to explain what's happening, right? She says, on the second Wednesday, my life turns upside down. I won't sing the song, but you get the idea. Fast is slow, slow is fast, up is down, day is night, cat is dog, thin is fat, because the world is turning turtle. East and west, in is out, the world is turning turtle, which of course doesn't really help either. But Mary Poppins then interrupts her and says, Topsy, I think I understand what you're saying, but you just need a change in perspective. If you just stand upside down, like the store is upside down, then everything will be normal again. And as Mary says this, she begins to sing a song, and as she sings, everybody finds themselves no longer on the floor that was the ceiling, but now on the ceiling that is the floor, if that makes sense, right? So they're up by the chandeliers now, or they're up by the tables, I should say, that are up here. And so the camera now has them upside down, right? Picture them upside down. But in reality, they're actually standing right side up, right? They're standing by the table and chairs on what should be the floor. And so the camera then turns and everything is good again. The perspective is right. They're on the floor right side up. And now that everything is sorted out, the children then proceed to ask Topsy to solve their problem, right? Here's this bowl. And they tell her that their mother gave them this bowl, and she said it was very valuable, and asked Topsy if she can fix it and, be really careful and not break it any worse. And Topsy says, of course, I can fix this bowl, but it's not as valuable as you think, or at least not in the way you think. It's not worth a lot of money. You're not going to be able to sell this to pay for your house. It might be valuable, as your mother said, but that's not because it's worth a lot of money. And Topsy says, for once, Cousin Mary is right. It's all in the way that you look at things. So about 2,000 years ago, there was a crazy person who lived in the area that we now call Israel. He was a little like Mary Poppins. Everybody around him knew that he was amazing, right? That amazing things happened when he was around, but they also thought that he was a little off his rocker, right? He just doesn't understand the way the world works. He just says dumb things sometimes, right? It just doesn't make sense. Even his own followers thought that. They didn't understand what he was saying, right? But it was on purpose. And that's because he believed that he wasn't the crazy one, that in fact, he was the one that saw things as they really were, that everybody else was living in an upside-down world, and that he had come to flip the world right side up again. Of course, his name is Jesus, and one of the best examples of this idea, flip of the world upside down, is in the Gospel of Matthew chapter 5, and I'll have the words on the screen as well, hopefully, this morning for you. But it starts in verse 1. Matthew is one of the first followers of Jesus. Now, in the normal way of things, Matthew is the last person you expect to be following a Jewish rabbi as a disciple or an apprentice, right? That you would want godly people, right? People who had the whole Bible memorized. Those are the kind of people that get to be apprentices of a rabbi. Matthew was as holy as unholy as a person could be. Someone that no respecting person would want to be associated with. He was a tax collector, ostracized by everyone. But Jesus asked him to follow, and Matthew did. And Matthew tells this story of Jesus. This is towards the very beginning of Jesus' ministry in the Gospel of Matthew. And Jesus gives this teaching really as the beginning of what we now call the Sermon on the Mount. And it's here in Matthew, starting in verse 1. Matthew chapter 5, starting in verse 1. Now when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up on a mountainside and sat down. His disciples came to him and began to teach him. He said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will show mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you." Thanks be to God for his written word. Amen. So sometimes I think we get these blessings of Jesus, the Beatitudes, a little bit wrong, right? There's a lot of misunderstanding sometimes when we look at these Beatitudes. Now, Jesus isn't saying that these are timeless truths about the way the world works. If he was saying that, he would obviously be wrong, right? If you have the scripture in front of him, you can see and remember what I just read, right? Very regularly, people who mourn are not comforted, right? People who mourn, you can imagine yourself, certainly people you know, but imagine people in countries that are war-torn. Oftentimes, their country is just continually torn, right? They don't get comforted, they get met with more violence, right? They're not comforted at all. People who hunger for righteousness and justice are often left waiting for it their entire lives, right? We all kind of take as a matter of fact the fact that our justice system is broken. Those And that this isn't something that like people on one side of the aisle politically disagree on, right? Everybody would agree on, no matter what your political opinions are, that there is no peace in our world. There is no justice. So what is it that Jesus is saying if he's not saying that this is the way the world works? What is Jesus doing? I want to suggest this morning that Jesus is standing on the ceiling. Jesus came to announce the good news. Now, as soon as you hear that comment, we think of religious language. But in the original language of the New Testament, that word for good news is euangelion, which has become the word gospel in English, right? And it takes on a life of its own. In Christian circles, we all have some idea of what the word gospel means, and it's a religious word. But back in Jesus' day, it was not religious at all. The Jewish people didn't use this, for instance, right? This was a word in kind of secular, quote-unquote secular usage, right, in the rest of the world. The euangelion, the good news announcement in Jesus' day, would be an announcement for some kind of political thing, is how we would think of it. A new king, maybe. The emperor is being crowned, or that there's a big military victory. We've just won this great battle. A gospel proclamation for ancient people might be that the Caesar has had a son, and so now we know that the royal bloodline will continue. And this is good news because in their world, the kind of transfer of power was always up for grabs, right? If the emperor doesn't have a son, or the emperor's son isn't very good, the entire empire will be thrown into chaos, civil wars, and coups. And so that kind of announcement is good news. In our day, if we would think about euangelion, a good news announcement would be the announcement of the president, right? We kind of take it for granted now, unfortunately, to our detriment, but having that peaceful transfer of power every 4 or 8 years for the president, every 6 years for senators, right? 2 years for our representative, like all that kind of stuff is really unique in human history. And so many parts of our world do not enjoy that kind of peaceful transition of power. So it is good news every January when that is announced. The reason I bring all of that up is that word euangelion, the gospel, good news, is not good advice. And sometimes that's how we treat the gospel when we think of it as a religious thing, right? It's not good advice. It's not saying if you do this thing, you'll get this thing, right? That's not what the gospel announcement is about. The gospel isn't really about us. It's not about you. The gospel is an announcement that something has happened and now the world is different because that happened. I'll give another illustration before we dive deeper here. So I don't know if you know about the musical Hamilton, but we've really liked listening to the music over the last few years. If you don't know, Hamilton is this musical about the founding father, it's centered around Hamilton's life, who's one of the founding fathers, but it tells the story of the country's history in those first years centered around his life because he was so central to the beginning of American history. If you don't know, he was the first Treasury Secretary of the United States. He's on the $10 bill, all of that. But in the musical, it centers in his life, but really about two parts of American history. The first part is that Revolutionary War, and the second part is then about the country kind of building the Constitution and accepting the Constitution and forming itself in those early years when things were not guaranteed, right? And it needed people like Hamilton to be able to guide the nation through. So the climax of the first act of the musical is the end of the Revolutionary War, and it's called Yorktown. If you know your history, you know Yorktown is the last battle of the Revolutionary War where the British surrendered after that battle. So that song about Yorktown kind of takes a lot of the themes of the musical all together. It is really dramatic and awesome. And it repeats these words over and over again, though, once it comes to its kind of climax. It just says over and over again, the world turned upside down. The world turned upside down. And the first time I heard it, and even probably other times I hear it, it's one of those songs where you get goosebumps listening to it, right? As an American, this is essential to who we are, right? Our founding story, that we were these underdogs that rose up against the tyranny and oppression of the British and cast them out, right? And won our freedom on the field of battle. And it's really a David and Goliath kind of story that's so essential to our national identity, right? And so when we can all sing that together, right? The world turned upside down and this new nation was born out of that. So in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus is really announcing that the world has been turned upside down. That just like the early Americans, the people of God at Jesus' time were waiting for this triumphal victory. They were waiting for a day when God would come back to his people again. And Jesus is saying, he says this over and over again in language that sometimes we misunderstand, but they understood, that day is here. In Matthew, he calls it the kingdom of heaven is at hand. In the other Gospels, he usually uses the term the kingdom of God. But it's the same idea. God has come to become king again on the earth. He is set up, he's going to redeem his people and set them free. They've been ruled by foreign empires for centuries and they're tired of it. God promised all these things, that he would return his presence to them, that he would give them a king again, that he would set things right and overthrow the evil empire. And that time is at hand. But if God is going to be king, and the kingdom of heaven really is at hand, as Jesus just said in the Gospel of Matthew before he gives these words of the Beatitudes, if the evil empire is about to be overthrown and all that kingdom stuff is happening, why would we then be persecuted, right? Why would we want to be meek? Why would we be blessed if we're peacemakers? Like, the language doesn't compute, right? Jesus, you're not making sense here. If the world is turned upside down and we're going to get our hope, why would we want to be peacemakers? We can't win a war if we don't fight. That's just how the world works. And we've so often interpreted the Sermon on the Mount that continues from here that kind of way. Like, it's nice that you have these ideals of a kingdom that's in the future, that, that maybe after we die, that kind of stuff, those ideals are nice. But this is the real world that we live in. I mean, what would happen if we don't fight? Then the bad guys would win. If we hold to principle, but they don't, then they will surely win. Surely Jesus doesn't expect us to live like that now, because it's just not the way the world works. But that's what I've been trying to say, is that Jesus is saying, in fact, it is exactly the way the world works, because it's flipped upside down. We forget the same thing that the disciples often did not understand, that Jesus tried to drop breadcrumbs all throughout his ministry, that God becomes king not by triumphing in war, by defeating people and slaughtering his enemies and leaving a pile of bodies in the wake. God becomes king by actually dying himself. That the defeat of the powers of evil comes on Jesus, and he takes their weight on himself on the cross. Jesus doesn't wipe out the Romans. Jesus dies for the Romans. Jesus doesn't get revenge on the Jewish leaders who plotted his death. Jesus dies for the Jewish leaders. Jesus doesn't condemn his disciples who abandoned him. He doesn't tell them to get away from him. Instead, he dies for them and immediately forgives them. Jesus knew that his kingdom is a different kind of kingdom. It's not because it's a spiritual kingdom, otherworldly, and only something that happens after we die. It's different because it comes from God. Every nation and kingdom in the world, it has a human origin, right? There's some story that we tell ourselves about humans made it, right? Just like the Battle of Yorktown was won because of people like Alexander Hamilton. But this kingdom that Jesus is bringing is different. It doesn't come from human beings. It comes from God, and the person that brings it is the God human being, Jesus himself. He breaks into our world through self-giving love, sacrificing himself for the good of everyone else to bring that kingdom in his own death. It's a kingdom, then, that has completely opposite values of ours. And that's why I have this slide that I hope tries to get that idea across, that the cross really is this scandal of the upside-down kingdom. It makes no sense to our world. In our world, a good life means that you live a long time, right? That you have a successful career, right? That you have wealth and live to your old age, and that you have victory over your enemies, right? And a lot of us, that isn't on the battlefield as much as it is at our workplaces or in politics, right? But we always have victory over our enemies. But in the kingdom of Jesus, people who are wealthy and healthy and victorious, that's not the Beatitudes at all. It's the humble, the meek, the poor, the mourners, the persecuted. They're the ones who are blessed. And Jesus is really announcing that the beginning of a new era has come for God's world and God's people. It's an announcement that everything has changed. And God is acting in and through Jesus to turn the world upside down, to pour out his blessings on everyone who will accept his lordship, everyone who will accept this new thing that God is doing through him. It's not a list of people who God who seem blessed, right? It's an announcement of a new upside down world that is coming. No matter how far you feel from God, even if you're a tax collector who is rejected by your people, who has even rejected God by your own actions, it doesn't matter. Jesus is pursuing you, and he wants you to live with him now. Through Jesus, the life of heaven will become the life of earth. And one day, God will transform the earth to become a place of beauty and peace and justice and joy, just as God always intended. That is the Christian hope. It's been our hope for 2,000 years now of followers of Jesus, is that Jesus will return to finish that job. And those who follow Jesus now are invited to live in that reality now. And there's lots of ways we can talk about living in that reality now. This morning I'm talking about it as an upside down world, an upside down kingdom, right? Sometimes we talk about the new creation, the kingdom of God, the life of heaven. But the point is that isn't just a someday in the future, as important as that is. But the point of that hope is that it radically transforms the way we live now, because it's already started in and through Jesus and in and through us. Jesus is announcing that the way we think the world works, with the unrighteous and the unjust getting their way, with the vengeful getting away with violence, with the poor being oppressed by the rich, all of that is the values of the old order that is passing away. The power of our world might seem blessed, and they might even be blessed for their life right now, but that blessing is a mirage. Even though we live in a world where justice is not done and the meek are trampled and the persecuted just end up executed, Jesus expects his followers to live as if the kingdom of heaven has already come. Jesus calls us to live in a way that makes sense within that promised future, because that future has somehow, in a way that is very hard to see sometimes and understand, that future has already intersected with the present. It may seem upside down, but we are called to believe that that is in fact right side up. It's our world that's actually upside down. As Topsy tells us, as Mary Poppin tells us, it is just a matter of perspective. So that all sounds crazy. That's okay, because it's supposed to, right? We live in this world that is upside down, and everything in our world forms us to think in ways that are upside down, right? Everywhere you go. And this is the thing why gathering together as a church is so important, because this is probably the only hour of the week where you're reminded of how the world actually works. The rest of the week, everybody's going to tell you that might makes right and justice is a pipe dream, right? But in this gathering together, we are reminded of how the world actually works. And the first followers of Jesus had to wrestle with this same reality. Like, what does it mean that the world is upside down when it so obviously feels like it's not, like things are still broken? The early Christians had to deal with that same tension, that same angst that we have. And it's okay to have some angst about that not being the true, not the way that things seem, right? So the early Christians are dealing with that all the time, and lucky for us, they recorded a lot of how they were dealing with it, including in the letters of the New Testament. And I want to draw our attention to one of those in this last part this morning. So in a letter we call 1 Corinthians, the Apostle Paul is a leader in the early church who has had his authority questioned. That's what's happening, kind of the background of this passage. The Corinthians were really well-educated people who they really liked the Greek philosophers of their day who were trained to be like great public speakers, right? Expert communicators that had all the right schooling, education. And so they were judging Paul according to those standards, right? And Paul just doesn't measure up. Paul tells us in other places that he is not a physically attractive person. He doesn't have a great voice. He's kind of hard to listen to, right? If we tried to listen to Paul, he might not even keep our attention, right? But Paul, in response, and that's what this passage will show us, Paul doesn't argue that they're wrong. He doesn't try to justify himself. He doesn't tell them, actually, I am a really good writer and thinker. You just need to read my letters. It doesn't come across as well as when I speak it, but if you just read my stuff, you would see how great it is. He doesn't say any of that. And he doesn't try to attack them either. He doesn't meet their criticism with criticism of themselves, even though, he probably would be justified in criticizing them for caring about that kind of thing. No, instead, Paul wants to explain to them that the world is upside down and the values of this world are different than the values of the kingdom that has already invaded the present. And so that's what this passage is about. And he specifically talks about this message of the kingdom really as the message of the cross. So here we go. For the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to those who are being saved, it is the power of God. That verse is probably enough in and of itself, right? For those who are perishing, for those who don't know the truth of Jesus, it is foolishness, and it should be. It doesn't make sense. That's what I'm trying to help us understand this morning. But for those of us who do know the truth of Jesus and do understand, because we've been given that gift of God, it is the power of God. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, the intelligence of the intelligent I will frustrate. Where is the wise person? Where is the teacher of the law? Where is the philosopher of the age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since in the wisdom of God, the world through its wisdom did not know him, God was pleased through the foolishness of what was preached to save those who believe. Because everything Paul preaches, just like everything every Christian preacher preaches, is foolishness, right? It doesn't make sense with the way this world works. And then he says, Jews demand signs, Greeks look for wisdom, fancy philosophy, but we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to the Jews and foolishness to Gentiles. No matter what your background, it doesn't make sense. But to those whom God has called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God, and the wisdom of God. So he's saying in the upside down world, kingdom that's breaking in fact, it is the power of God and it is the wisdom of God. For the foolishness of God is wiser than human wisdom, and the weakness of God is stronger than human strength. So in this passage, Paul is really telling us that the foolishness of God is wiser than human wisdom, because the whole thing is upside down. Up is down, left is right, fast is slow. The world is turning turtle. The kingdom of heaven that Jesus is announcing, that is invading earth through him, is a kingdom that flips everything upside down. And then for the Corinthians, that was the wisdom of the great teachers who were trained in the best communication strategies. But that is not how it's not how God has chosen to reveal himself. We could think, and I mentioned this a few weeks ago, that Jesus could have done things so much different. Instead of taking a ragtag group of uneducated Jewish fishermen and tax collectors and all these people who were kind of outcasts of Jewish society, Jesus didn't even need to use the Jews, right? He could have even gone to a Gentile world if he really wanted to reach the whole world. Why didn't he just go to Caesar himself? He could have healed somebody in Caesar's family, the most powerful person in the world, and gotten the favor of the Roman emperor. He could have gone to the philosophical headquarters of the ancient world in Greece and taught there. He was as smart and as wise as the best philosophers of his day. But Jesus doesn't do that. And Paul tells us why. Because Jesus shows who he is and who God is most centrally, most clearly, in the most humiliating act of Jesus' life. When he submitted to the Jewish authorities, when he submitted to the Roman authorities and let them mock him and beat him and crucify him. And as he suffered and died, that is how God reveals the power that he has in some paradoxical, backwards, upside down way. Paul says that the cross is how God revealed himself to the world. That the God who creates and sustains the entire created order reveals himself not through wisdom or power, but through crucifixion and Jesus turning the world upside down. So it's easy for us this morning to forget in the daily parts of our life, like as soon as we walk out of here, right? To go get groceries, we go out to eat, go to work, right? We scroll through social media, like we go in our lives. It's just very easy to forget, right? That this thing has happened, that the world is no longer the same because of it, right? As followers of Jesus, we have to live in that tension with a world that doesn't know the truth. Our world will do whatever it can to distract us, if not get us to reject the values of Jesus' kingdom. And that those values of this world, this old creation that's passing away, will seep into us and have seeped into us, whether we realize it or not. Whether it's our obsession with financial wealth, we want more money so we can have more stuff, so we can do more stuff, we can go on better vacations, we can have a better retirement, we can buy cars or houses or update the ones we have. Our values to value our loyalty to our tribes, right? We forget that our primary identity is as citizens of the kingdom of heaven, and instead we have our loyalty to our political party, and we have to hate the other side, right? Or we have our primary identity as a part of our country, and so we have to hate the other people in other countries. We care about only people here instead. We value self-sufficiency, right? That we want to be independent and of anyone else, that we need financial security so we can live life the way we want to live it. We want to maintain our health and independence, so that because we would rather die than live a life of dependence on others. But the kingdom of heaven has the radically different values, the upside down values. In the kingdom of heaven, it's those who mourn who get comforted. It's the persecuted who are rewarded. It's the people who seek justice and righteousness that are fulfilled. People who are meek, people who are dependent, are actually the ones who inherit everything. So the invitation for us is to live as if we believe Jesus is King. King Jesus, our Lord and King, demands our absolute loyalty and allegiance. He asks us to surrender our lives to him, to the crucified one, to give ourselves even to others as he gave himself for you. So Jesus invites his church in all times and places, including us here, to live as if the kingdom has already come. Because for us, it already has. Because for us, it already has, and his Spirit lives within us. Jesus invites us to live right side up in an upside down world. Let's pray together.